All right, so we've now made it past sort of the theoretical backdrop of human rights in the course, and we're turning our attention to the way that anthropologists have engaged with human rights. And to get there, we start with Mark Goodale's Surrendering to Utopia, because he provides a very, very nice description of the sort of historical path that anthropology has had to tread in order to start having a say about human rights. So I'll give you just a couple of things from the introduction, and then move into the chapters that were assigned for the week. So now, as I say, we've seen the theoretical underpinnings of human rights with Kant, Mill, and Locke, and we've seen that the three of them account for really almost all of the major theoretical underpinnings of the Declaration of Human Rights. What we find there, then, is that they make or they contribute to the case for what ought to be rights and what we ought to do or honor about or refrain from doing to others. So then this notion of ought signals that these are moral claims of a certain sort. So then they're giving us moral and political philosophies, which is why the notion of ought is central to all of them. Goodale notes from his opening page, though, that anthropologists, they're not doing that kind of work. Their focus is on observing and describing how things actually work out in practice. So we're shifting our attention from what we ought to do to what actually happens between people. It's responding to a different kind of question then, and doing a different sort of work, less abstract, more concrete. In his introduction then, Goodale says that human rights theory has become settled and static, in spite of the fact that it's not fully satisfying or adaptable to a constantly changing world. And he thinks that anthropology provides a kind of alternative for thinking about human rights at the conceptual level by providing what he calls a critical history of different human rights genealogies. So what does he mean by genealogy? You can think of a genealogy on the model of a family tree, right? Like that is a kind of genealogy. And so you trace back your family heritage through this tree. There are going to be certain branches that dead end in places. There are going to be others that are continuous. They branch off in places and so forth. So he's drawing on the notion then that ideas, practices, political movements, all of these sorts of things are also genealogical in nature. And that the one that we wind up with in the present is not necessarily the only one. It's not like there's just one single continuous line that describes the emergence and development of human rights, but rather there are competing ideas. Again, some of them wind up in dead ends, some of them branch off in ways that get marginalized or excluded, some are lost to the mists of history. And he thinks that anthropology offers an opportunity to recover some of those, to present them in a way that they haven't been presented in the past, to shed a light on them that has hitherto been denied them. So secondly then, he thinks that grounding human rights theory in what he calls culture in the world, or, quote, the ways in which collectivities continue to self-identify in a manner that reflects an exclusionary, not a unifying social ontology. So another way of putting this is to say that the way that people work out their cultural lives in the world is not through some great sense of human unity that spans all peoples across all times. Rather, just look at the nature of nation states. they tend to be exclusionary, which is not to say that nation states are directly identical with something that we might want to call culture, or the realm of the cultural or anything like that. But you can see that people identify in particular ways, and that identification necessarily excludes others who don't share that identification. And so identity is always simultaneously inclusive and exclusive. And this is what he's pointing to, is that this is how culture in the world functions. It has this exclusionary aspect to it. And this presents a certain kind of problem for human rights that aspires to be unifying, aspires to be universal. So then he borrows the term human rights in the vernacular. We're going to come back to that toward the end of the semester in the reading by Sally Engel Mary. And so we'll deal with that again in her writing, which is the one he borrows it from. But he borrows that notion of human rights in the vernacular, right, in everyday talk, to emphasize how we have to theorize human rights and how human rights find legitimacy. That is, in terms of the groundedness of social practices, those mundane yet often transformative occurrences of the practice of everyday life. He's signaling here then that there's a way that you can have a sort of, let's say, global ecumene, right? So that you have a language of human rights born in, to follow the metaphor, the scripture of human rights, which would be the Declaration of Human Rights. But you also have the vernacular, the way that people on the ground in everyday life actually engage with and practice human rights. So that what you might find in a local human rights agency or commission or something like that, in one place, in one part of the world, will certainly be aware of the sort of global language of human rights and the institutions like the UN that promulgate it, but they're also going to do things in their own way, in ways that are shaped by and relevant to the social reality in which they're functioning. Right? So this is what he's pointing to with an anthropology of human rights. This is what he thinks anthropology has to provide to discussions of human rights, to thinking about human rights, to discourses of human rights. Before we get to that, though, before we get to how anthropologists are actually tackling the way that people engage with human rights in their vernacular lives, we have to go through a little bit of history first. So now we get to the chapters that we're looking at specifically for this week. He opens this history with the assertion that anthropology was exiled from the formative period of human rights development. That came after World War II. That was when the United Nations formed. That was when Eleanor Roosevelt became the chair of, in the post-World War II era, the chair of the drafting committee that drafted the Declaration of Human Rights. And he thinks then that that period and anthropology's exclusion from those discussions was consequential both for human rights and for anthropology. But he goes on. He proposes that anthropology does have a role in considering human rights, not just as an emancipatory mechanism, which is sort of its life within the United Nations, but also as something that anthropologists can study, right? So that it can be an object of study and not just this set of instruments or mechanisms or tools to pursue liberty for people, to pursue all of those principles, all of those oughts that Mill and Locke and Kant argued in favor of. Now, before making that argument, he traces the history of anthropology's marginalization from debates about human rights. And the reason that he does this is that there was a sense among some anthropologists, like Melville Herskovits, who we'll come back to in just a moment, that when we're looking at global pluralism, the pluralism of cultures, as he would have thought about it, more or less, anthropology is the leading voice in the scientific study of that plurality, of the specific cultures that make up the social world. And so he would say then, Herskovits, that there was a natural fit between anthropology and understandings of what human rights ought to be, and how we would go about understanding what they ought to be. So now the point of contact between anthropology and the drafting committee at the UN was a statement by Melville Herskovits. It's often thought, as Goodale points out, that he was writing to the drafting committee as a representative of the American Anthropological Association, but he suggests that that's not true, that actually it was his position with the National Science Foundation that attracted the attention of the drafting committee. And as we'll see, it wasn't all that consequential in the end, in any case. So, like many anthropologists, Herskovits was sympathetic to the anti-colonial struggles in many places where anthropologists did fieldwork. So this is an important moment in European and really global history, right? Because up until that point, European powers like France, Spain, the United Kingdom had held colonies really exhaustively around the world, with very, very few exceptions. Thailand, interestingly, being one of those exceptions. And it was only after World War II, especially starting in the 1950s, that there was a rash of anti-colonial struggles that were successful in wresting the nation states that had formed as colonies, had been formed by European powers as colonies, that succeeded in wresting them from the English colonists and colonial powers and establishing them as independent nation states. Herskovits and other anthropologists were sympathetic to that. They found it difficult to stand behind colonialism as a justified usurpation of territory and peoples in the world. And so that led to a certain apprehension around human rights then. To Herskovits, not him alone, but he's the one who's relevant here, human rights looked very European in flavor. And we can see part of the reason for that because we've been through now these three major figures, all of whom were European, who had such a dramatic impact on the conceptualization of human rights. And so his concern was that this would be just one more exercise in Western chauvinism that inherited the chauvinism of colonialism. And so he was quite hesitant on those grounds. So this concern for subalterns, as they put it, you can think of subalterns as being marginalized people, subject people, people who are subject to power but not in a position to wield it themselves. That's sort of the rough scope of what subaltern entails. So this concern for subaltern people around the world, formerly colonized people or people just emerging from colonialism, partly arises from anthropologists' recognition at that time of the compromising relationship that anthropology had had with colonial powers in the past. So the reason for that is that many anthropologists were doing their anthropological work in places that were colonies of the nations from which they came. So someone who we don't look at in this course but would figure as an example of this E. Evans Pritchard, who is a famous and very, very important British anthropologist, did his anthropological work in parts of Africa that were British colonies. And similarly with really the foundational figure in anthropological fieldwork, Malinowski. Malinowski, he himself was of Polish ancestry, but he was a Cambridge, I want to say, I think not Oxford, I think Cambridge anthropologist who was doing field work in the Trobriand Islands. So the islands off the eastern shore of New Guinea. Also a British colony, right? And so there's a way that anthropology had something of a parasitic relationship with colonialism early on. And anthropologists often were able to go and do research in those places because they could gain entry through colonial officials. And so it was a fraught relationship. And some of what we're seeing with Herskovits and other anthropologists since then as well, of course, is this wish to disavow and rectify the relationship of anthropology to the people they studied, that anthropologists studied, right? Wanting not to have this kind of parasitic colonial relationship. And so in this case, you get Herskovits expressing his reluctance to just get on board uncritically with a document and an institution that he thinks will have global reach. He was correct about that. And that will have a certain amount of power and sway around the world that may not actually work in the favor of these people who had been colonized by European powers in the past, who had become subaltern as a result of this. Okay, so moving along then. Herskovits, like other anthropologists, not so much now, but at that time, subscribed to an idea that each culture, first of all, that there was such a thing as a discrete culture, developed through situated evolution. So then you get certain aspects of culture, law, politics, religion, morality, kinship structures, things like that. They develop in particular ways for each cultural group, given the specific history and circumstances of that group. So it's evolution in the sort of Darwinian notion of evolution, given the specific aspects of the environments, social as well as physical, in which they emerged. We'll come back to that notion a little bit later on in the following chapter. But for the moment, what's important is that Herskovits had this idea of cultures as reflecting situated evolution. The result of this, then, was that culture, in that view, had to be understood in particular terms. So there wasn't anything universal or general about human sociality. Human sociality was always specific to a given culture. Again, I want to emphasize, this is the view from that moment. That this is not a view that really persists in the present in anthropology. That notion of culture came under quite stern criticism within anthropology. We'll see that again, as I say, in toward the end of the lecture. So then there's a further implication of this. That is that there are no universal ways to evaluate or measure cultures. There are only particular ways, particular to the specific culture. Because, why? Every standard of evaluation that you would want to use to evaluate a culture is itself culturally specific, right? So that there are no models for evaluation that are independent of the culture in which they exist. Therefore, you're always, if you're always evaluating from somewhere, right? You always have a perspective from somewhere. You don't have a kind of God's eye perspective or a universal perspective. Clearly then, given that human rights has these universal aspirations, this view is at odds with human rights. So then, let's just summarize Herskovits' two concerns so far. First of all, norms, values, the organization of institutions, all of these things are culturally specific. They're not universal, they're not general. Further, the enforcement of human rights norms through mechanisms and institutions that have a global reach could be damaging to peoples who have already suffered under and been left vulnerable by European colonialism. In other words, it could just become colonialism under a new guise, a new way of asserting a European chauvinism, a European conviction that its way is the best and the universal way to which all peoples should aspire, should want to aspire. Herskovits was not on board with that kind of project. Now, having said all this, as Goodale points out, there's no real evidence that the drafting committee considered Herskovits' statement as it was generating the declaration, and there's no real evidence that it was consulting anthropologists or the anthropological record at all. Now, in part, this is because of the strong legal disposition of those who composed the first drafts of the declaration. So the drafting committee was made up, there was an inner circle of, I think, 8 people. Goodale notes them by name. And he points out that the majority of those people came from a legal background. They were judges or lawyers or legal theorists. So there's a very legalistic mentality informing the way that the draft was constructed. So the flip side of anthropology's early marginality, then, because anthropologists were not of that kind of legalistic bent, the flip side of their marginality with respect to human rights is that anthropologists also just didn't seem all that interested in talking about human rights. Anthropologists wanted to do anthropology. They wanted to do things like understand kinship systems and how kinship systems related to political structures, or how kinship and economy were connected, how moral and economic practices were interrelated. These were the things that were fascinating for anthropologists, not reflection on human rights, especially not reflection on human rights at this very sort of abstract conceptual level, rather than through the groundedness of ethnographic fieldwork, which is the calling card of anthropology. So then, after presenting Herskovits' preoccupations and concerns, Goodale goes on to recite some of the criticisms leveled against Herskovits. An acknowledgement that cultural relativism, something we'll come back to again in the next chapter in more detail, but for short, the idea that norms, values, and so forth exist only relative to the culture in which they appear. So that cultural relativism arose to contest forms of oppression like racism and colonialism. So that would be roughly Herskovits' position. But the critics would say, how does cultural relativism allow for any kind of critique or opposition to Nazism, something that was clearly on their minds at that time? The argument of the relativists, they would say, is that there's no independent position from which you can criticize Nazism. You have to judge it in its own terms. That's the principle of relativism. And so clearly this is quite a stunning blow to the anthropological position that Herskovits wanted to take up. There's a feeling after the war, I would argue until today, that you have to be able to critique Nazism. That there's no way of simply saying, well, we just have to live with it because it has its own internal norms and values, and we can't critique those from the outside and so forth. That is a very, very difficult position for relativists to hold, of course, and it's a stinging rebuke from those who want to criticize cultural relativists. So then we wind up on this critique with this paradox that seems completely intolerable. It claims that one cannot pass judgment on the practices of another culture or the members of another culture from outside that culture's own terms. And what makes it worse is that we can't even do it when the members of that culture engage in practices that condemn your own culture in their own terms. It leaves you defenseless against that kind of cultural attack, let's say. So this is the kind of critique that was leveled against relativists like Herskovits, or as Herskovits was presented as being by his critics. Now, Goodale thinks that Herskovits' critics misconstrue his position in several ways. So he was reluctant to endorse the declaration because he thinks anthropology is the science of human culture. So therefore, all other disciplines are in no better position to offer a scientific position on human rights in scientific terms, and he thinks anthropology is in no position to offer a scientific evaluation of human rights. So therefore, no discipline is in a position to offer a scientific judgment of human rights. He's most concerned with anthropology, of course, but he thinks that the obstacles that anthropologists face in terms of evaluating these universalistic claims, that's where you get the most robust take or study of cultures, and therefore it's the most important discipline to consult in these terms. So if anthropology can't do it, nobody can do it, and therefore there's a real problem in his view with human rights because it can't anchor itself scientifically on human sociality or on an understanding of human sociality. Now, that doesn't do much of anything to help anthropology speak to human rights, but you can see from that where his hesitancy to embrace human rights comes from. He wants it to be scientific if it's going to have this kind of global claim, and he thinks that it cannot sustain itself scientifically because anthropology can't provide that kind of scientific basis, and no other discipline can do it better than anthropology. So that's one thing that Goodale thinks his critics misconstrue. Secondly, he proposes that there is a hard core of similarities across cultures, a sort of pan-human hard core of similarities. And perhaps those could form the basis of shared human rights, but that's not what you find in the declaration, he says. Now, we never learn in his piece. It's not very long. It's 6 or 7 pages, something like that. It's quite dense and tight. So he mentions this hardcore of similarities, but he doesn't say what they are. He doesn't give any examples. So we don't know what they are, and we don't therefore know what he would imagine human rights could be if it were attentive to the anthropological findings of this hardcore of similarities. And then finally, he was concerned that the Declaration would become a doctrine wielded to deny peoples their right to control and settle their own affairs. His accusation then, in a nutshell, is that the proposed declaration reflected the aspirations and standards of a single culture, European, masquerading as universal aspirations and standards, and that it could do this largely because of its historical success at subjugating other peoples. It was in a powerful position to assert itself again, not as a colonial power proper, but in kind of an imperialistic way. So we get this. This is not from the book. This is taken from the statement itself. So he says, the primary task confronting those who would draw up a declaration on the rights of man, Declaration of Human Rights, is thus, in essence, to resolve the following problem. How can the proposed declaration be applicable to all human beings and not be a statement of rights conceived only in terms of the values prevalent in the countries of Western Europe and America? Right? In a nutshell, that's his concern. His misgivings, though, went largely unheard. Human rights, the drafters of the Declaration and human rights theorists didn't include them in their debates. They didn't really capture the imagination of anthropologists and set anthropologists off on a course of study of human rights. And so anthropologists and human rights theorists remained largely estranged from one another for several decades, really. Now, that's not to say, though, that anthropologists were completely absent from the formation of UN statements. So when UNESCO was generating a statement on race, it drew heavily on anthropologists. And they all advocated for the position, which UNESCO accepted, that race is a social construct. So it's not a biological given, it is a social construct. Still, anthropologists, even through this question of race, had very little to say on human rights or the idea of that there are transcultural universals until it started to undergo an internal change. And that change involved anthropologists increasingly adopting a Marxist or a neo-Marxist model for doing anthropology. And this provided an alternative universalizing framework through which they could think of the particular as an example of something more universal. So then they get through this a methodological orientation to assessing the historical contexts of inequality, which very conveniently allows for a critique of the colonial history of many of the places that they're studying, and further on the inevitability of conflict within any given society or community. So, and this again, this is a fairly straightforwardly Marxist, or you could say political economic view, that conflict is an elemental part of human sociality. It's not an outlier. It's not something that needs to be explained. It's something in terms of which you explain social dynamics. So you explain sociality within the frame of conflict. And so these are sort of these universal principles. And curiously enough, in spite of the fact that human rights, as we've seen, has this very kind of liberal bent, this more Marxist modeling gives a new route for anthropologists to enter into discussions of human rights. We see, however, that this is not completely new to anthropology. So this is not the invention of the wheel out of nothing, right? We can recall that Herskovits was concerned with the way that colonial powers justified denying colonized people the autonomy to manage their own affairs, according to their own principles, according to their own norms and values, according to their own traditions, etc. So that when in the 1970s, this movement that you find within anthropology to protect indigenous rights emerged, that was not really a radical departure from previous anthropological concerns. It was formalized and institutionalized in particular ways, but it wasn't something that was aberrant within anthropology. What was new, though, was that it gave anthropologists a point of entry into the discussion of human rights. So then through the 80s and 90s, something else happened. Anthropology entered a period of crisis, internal to itself. It produced this crisis for itself. And so it fragmented into a number of different schools and approaches to the work of anthropology, what it means to represent another people. I won't go into all the details here. That could be a class all on its own. The point is then that it went into this period of fragmentation of crisis. And one of the products of that fragmentation and crisis was an increased politicization of anthropology. So then in some ways, it retreated from this kind of neutral scientific veneer that it had maintained earlier in its history, and instead started to take on a more political, more advocative, more of a role of an advocate. So then indigenous rights is a site for political anthropology, a political anthropology that increasingly wished to have a say about human rights, to have that say, right? That now anthropology, as a more politicized discipline, has its point of entry into these questions of human rights. And so eventually, the American Anthropological Association, the largest anthropological association in the world, would establish its own Committee for Human Rights with its own human rights projects. Now, around this time, the mid-1990s and early 2000s, curiously enough, just about the time that I was doing graduate studies, another change occurred in anthropology, its approach to engaging with human rights. That is, human rights practices in specific locations became topics for anthropological research. So then the plurality of human rights practices, which is to say that in different places, different people practiced human rights in their own specific ways. This plurality of human rights practices anthropologists studied led to plural conceptualizations of what human rights are and what legitimate human rights claims are. So we could characterize this as anthropology's shift from cultural relativism on questions of human rights and other things, which is a largely conceptual intervention, right? That human rights were conceptualized in these philosophical abstract terms, and cultural relativism was a conceptual abstract response to those universalizing claims. So then anthropologists at this point, in some cases, step away from that particular debate and instead embrace this pluralism of practices that bear the name human rights. And so they become focused not on the debate, but on the practices. And this is a dramatic shift for anthropologists. It allows a completely new way of engaging with human rights that's not primarily theoretical or conceptual in nature, but is based in people's practices. It is ethnographic in nature. Now, as such, it remains critical of how power can operate within human rights assertions, so that it can still be critical of the way that an institution like the UN might try to impose certain kinds of expectations on a given community, but it's also then optimistic about the potential emancipatory roles that human rights might play. Remember, anthropology still now has this more politicized disposition, and so emancipation is an issue for anthropologists. That's what they would like. Once again, I'd say this is not something that was foreign to Herskovits. This was something that was a deep concern to Herskovits, so that particular concern with emancipation is an arc that traces through this entire story. It's just not an arc that has followed the path laid out by human rights, which also considers itself an emancipatory discourse and an emancipatory set of aspirations. So then they're arriving at their desire for emancipation along quite distinct lines, but they're both now looking at that. And so anthropologists are starting to embrace the idea that human rights can have an emancipatory role, but that to see it, you have to study it in its particular instances, its particular manifestations, through specific observable practices. Okay, and now we get to a more considered history of relativism. So up until now, we've seen that to the extent that anthropology suffered criticism in its approaches to human rights, mostly those criticisms were allegations that anthropologists were inevitably going to be cultural relativists. So here then we get a more detailed explanation of what cultural relativism entails. But we should note a couple of things first. First off, for the most part, universalists and relativists are in this kind of logjam, so that whenever a theorist from one side makes any kind of move to outmaneuver the other side is going to have a counter move that it can make. And they're never really able to completely outmaneuver either side, so that they remain in this deadlock, neither side ever being forced to concede to the other side. Secondly, we can think of relativism in a couple of different ways. One is descriptive, the other is prescriptive. So the descriptive kind of relativism is simply the value-neutral description of difference in human sociality, which is to say, the forms of sociality that humans exhibit varies over time and from community to community. And so you can describe those differences without saying whether they're good or bad, but simply saying that they exist, that it's just, as a brute fact, sociality, forms of sociality are plural, not singular, among humans. Prescriptive relativism, on the other hand, is the assertion that one cannot make judgments from outside the principles of the community in question. So it comes back to the notion that Herskovits was criticized for holding, allegedly holding anyway, which again is the notion that falls afoul of this idea of, well, then what about the Nazis, right? Prescriptive and descriptive then are doing different things. One is making an assertion about how things ought to be. The other is simply describing the social world as it is, or social worlds, if you prefer, how they are. Now, Goodale points out that despite dismissiveness toward cultural relativism on the part of universalism, it's nonetheless remained persistent, and especially persistent for human rights. And this is not least because, as Upendra Bakshi points out, different cultures and civilizations have diverse notions of what it means to be human, and thus what it means for humans to have rights. And this is quoted from Goodale's book. right? So that if we don't have a single common notion of what a human being is or what human beings are, because it's not necessarily the case that human beings are going to be just one thing, well, then that creates problems for saying that humans all ought to have the same rights. If you don't adhere to an idea that all humans are fundamentally the same, it becomes difficult to make the case that humans that are diverse in their nature should all nonetheless have the same rights. So then, one example of this would be caste. If you're given to a notion of caste, then you're not providing an all or nothing version of humanity. Either everyone's human and either you're in or you're out. Everyone's human and then there are all the animals, or nothing, right? That would be one view. If you have a notion of caste, though, you might say that, well, there are humans, but there are different types of humans. And they need to be organized in specific ways with respect to one another because of their differences. And you can see this, the stereotypical example of this would be in India, but that's not the only example of caste. You could also say that in the US, there is a tradition of caste built along racial lines in originating with slavery, for example, but not exclusively with slavery. And so then you don't necessarily arrive at a notion of everybody naturally having a claim on the same rights. Certainly, that was not the view of slaveholding America, right? So then you can see then that Bakshi's point is that if you have different notions of what it means to be human, you don't just get this universal notion shared by everyone that humans ought to have rights, much less what those rights would be. Now, curiously enough, in anthropology, which many non-anthropologists assume to be preoccupied with culture as this just entity that simply exists all on its own, right? Capital C, culture. So non-anthropologists think that anthropologists are preoccupied with culture. And yet anthropology was excluded from commenting on human rights on the presumption that anthropologists would be automatic cultural relativists. Around the same time, though, anthropology was undertaking a serious critique of the concept of culture. So this is just sort of one of these ironic things that at exactly the time that non-anthropologists were accusing anthropologists of being culture-obsessed cultural relativists, anthropologists themselves were engaging in this very, very serious critique of the concept of culture. And so you got, for example, questions about, well, how can we define what a culture is? That it sounds like that's something that has clear borders. We can tell who's in and who's out. And that's not the case really much of anywhere, right? That wherever we would want to draw a circle to say everybody inside belongs to this culture, everybody outside is not part of this culture, we're going to discover that that line is so blurry that actually it becomes indistinct. Why? Because there are going to be many people who we can't quite tell if they're entirely in or they're entirely out. And so then you can't simply say there is a culture. Further, again, taking this Marxist view or Marxist-inspired view that conflict is inevitable, then if there are different positions within a culture that are in dispute with one another, that are both embarking on projects to make claims to how this group of people ought to organize themselves, well, then it's hard to say that they share the same values, because they're in dispute over exactly the values that people should hold. And so the notion of culture then as this sort of discrete entity that can be clearly defined, where it's obvious who's in and who's out, that notion starts to fall apart, really. And this is what anthropologists at this time are engaged in doing, is in throwing that notion into very serious question, and then from there figuring out, okay, so what is the work of anthropologists if we're not wedded to this capital C notion of culture? Now, you might be justified in asking, but weren't anthropologists advocating for cultural survival like just 5 minutes ago in relation to indigenous rights? Well, yes. So this story is not a straightforward story then. So it seems then that culture takes on this kind of instrumental value. So the defenders of indigenous rights invoke culture in this sort of heritage of cultural survival to defend historically subject peoples, subalterns again, from continuing incursions on traditional ways of, say, resolving conflicts or determining who can marry whom and so forth, things like that. That there's this notion that people should be able to decide those things for themselves in their own way. And so even though culture as that way of making that determination is now falling into disrepute, it still has this kind of instrumental value that defenders of indigenous rights could draw on to try and just get others to keep their noses out of their affairs. Proponents of Asian values, on the other hand, who are doing things from a different point of view, on the one hand, so there's something that feels a bit disingenuous about Asian values, and Goodale notes this as well. That on the one hand, they've been quite happy to adopt Western economic values, capitalism, for example, and yet they resist the adoption of Western notions of rights, claiming that those are not our values. Those are your European values. We have our own values. We prioritize harmony. We're more responsive to authority, and so rule by authoritative individuals rather than, say, democratically elected individuals. And yet, the curious thing, though, is that the people making these claims are typically elites. And they're making them as a way of defending a certain political formation that favors them, rather than really doing it to defend some cherished cultural formation. And so part of the Asian values claim is typically the suppression of dissent within the community that they claim to speak for. And yet you would ask, wait, if there's dissent by the people you claim to represent, how is that dissent not also an Asian value? Why is suppressing their aspirations somehow reflecting their aspirations? That doesn't make any sense, right? So there's a way of looking at it to say, this seems pretty cynical. And yet it has been a fairly successful way in some places, Singapore, Indonesia, China primarily, to say, well, you can have your human rights in the West, that's fine. Over here, we don't want things like a free press, because a free press leads to disharmony. It leads to criticism of leadership. It leads to lots of people creating a fuss over things. And we value harmony more than we value a free press, so we're not going to have a free press. We'll have a press, it's just not going to be a free press. And so this is the kind of argument that, from a cultural relativist point of view, it's very, very hard to mount a convincing critique of that. But once again, what is it that we see? We see that advocates of Asian values are employing culture in this kind of instrumental way as a means to an end, the end being defending this particular kind of political formation. Now, concerns with culture got more complicated, and they got more complicated with the recognition that the isolated cultures that early anthropologists studied no longer existed, if they ever existed in the first place. So again, if we were to go back to Evans Pritchard or Malinowski, the two of these sort of pioneering figures and giants within anthropology, on the one hand, the way that they write their ethnographies, it looks very much as if the Zande, whoever Evans Pritchard studied, or the Trobriand Islanders, who Malinowski studied, they appear to be these kind of isolated groups of people, internally coherent and so forth. But the larger context is that they both existed in colonial states, colonized by the British. And so the notion that they were somehow isolated is just not historically accurate, right? So then it may be that these idyllically isolated communities never actually existed. But even if they did, Goodale's point is that at this point in anthropology's work, so in the 80s and 90s, there is this sort of obviousness to anthropologists that global and local norms couldn't be extricated from one another anymore. They were sewn into each other in a way that made it impossible to separate them. And so you couldn't coherently talk about culture as this internally insulated, coherent set of social norms, values, practices, institutions, and so on. That was no longer available as a claim. And yet it was still, and is still, not possible to say that people around the globe are culturally alike. So that's a dilemma, right? On the one hand, you can't say then that you can clearly distinguish any set of norms if you accept the notion that norms are, say, representative of culture. That's not entirely given, but for the purposes of this discussion, because this is the way that the discussion unfolds with respect to human rights very often, we'll say norms. So it's not possible to say that global and local norms can simply be sorted out from one another in some tidy way where you can tell what's local and what's global. At the same time, you can also see that different people in different places or in different communities that even may be dispersed around the globe, not everybody does everything the same way. And so that allows relativism to maintain some kind of relevance, to say that the way that people do things, the way that it makes sense for people to do things, sense to themselves, matters and differs. So Goodale then embarks on a discussion of relativism as it has this sort of persisting importance in three different registers: philosophical, political, and phenomenological, or paradoxical. He talks about phenomenology and paradox together. So they're not the same thing, but they have to do with each other. I'll get to what that is down the road. The philosophical approach to relativism sees, quote, problems, social, moral, political, cultural, legal, as either conceptual in themselves, or, if not, then they believe that the solutions to problems should be conceptual. So there's this emphasis on the conceptual plane. As I say, I think this is very much in keeping with the way that the drafters were approaching human rights, partly given the nature of what a declaration is, and also partly given the legal background that most of the drafters had. So then this means that problems exist primarily in the sphere of ideas, right? So it's not a question of material reality, it's a question of ideal reality or ideals. And the conflicts then are between ideas. There's the clash of ideas. Problems then are not questions of practice or the contexts, say historical contexts, in which ideas arise, but rather the arena in which concepts compete with one another. These kinds of abstract notions of relativism can be subdivided in various ways, and he shows a number of writers have different and not necessarily mutually inclusive ways of thinking about how these ideas of relativism can subdivide. But the specifics here are less important. The specific ways you can subdivide them are less important than the historical tendency to treat relativism in this philosophical way as conceptual competition. The political approach is different. So it is more concerned than with the material and historical nature of relativism rather than the ideal model of relativism, the conceptual. Goodale explores how, as an example, George W. Bush extrapolated evangelical Christian values as universal values in the service of military adventures in Iraq. Right? So his argument there is that Bush made a number of universalistic claims about democracy, for example, about freedom, the aspiration for freedom that all people have, things like this, as justifications for the intervention in Iraq, sort of positioning the United States as kind of the handmaiden of freedom and democracy in the Middle East. But Goodale's point is that really what it came down to was the expression of evangelical Christian values posing as universal values. Or again, you find the same kind of maneuver in the way that Asian political and economic elites present their interests as Asian values in order to deny political rights to their citizenry. Now, as Goodale points out, Asian human rights activists can also play that game. And first, critique the notion that there is a monolithic static set of Asian values or Asian culture, and in particular, that the elites who claim to speak for Asian values, in fact, do speak for everyone who falls under their umbrella. And these critics would instead argue that within Asian values, you can find support for human rights. Down the road, one of the things that we'll see in this course is that I make the argument that human rights advocates in Thailand make the case that a particular vision of Buddhism provides for human rights. So it's not the Western route through Kant, Mill, and Locke to getting to human rights and those sort of liberal notions of emancipation and freedom, but that there is a specific Buddhist route to getting to human rights as a kind of emancipation, a kind of freedom, and a kind of egalitarianism as well. So then critics in Asia of Asian values, of the Asian values argument, will also say, well, no, we can find resources within this Asian society or this Asian culture that you advocate for human rights. So you actually can't simply dismiss human rights as being Western. We can claim human rights as Asian as well through Buddhism or what have you. So then Goodale tries to capture the political approach to relativism like this. He says, this is all a quote, "In other words, a political orientation to the problem of relativism and human rights is one that displaces the object of action from the conceptual, the sphere of ideas, to the actual, from the plane of the abstract ideals, in which any number of contingencies that might qualify the analysis of relativism and human rights are intentionally ignored or denied." So from that abstract plane to the plane of the practical, in which ideas are only one among many dimensions of concrete lived experience in the practice of everyday life. So he's come back to this notion of everyday life and of the way that discussions of human rights or of relativism can become anchored in everyday life, the way that people live their lives materially, in contact with one another, economically, politically, and not just on this plane of ideas where it's all abstraction. So phenomenology, very, very roughly, is the philosophy of experience, the study of experience, how people actually experience the world. I will not get into it further than that, partly because Goodale doesn't get into it further than that either. So this is the kind of angle that he's trying to take, that he thinks is the third major way that you can approach relativism. So the phenomenological paradox Goodale identifies is the sense of essential sameness among humans on one side. So that would be human rights universalists who claim that there is this essential sameness. And you can make that case. You can make a statement like humans are all basically the same, and you can back that up with listing whole series, probably an almost infinite number of ways. Infinite number? Don't think that makes sense. Anyway, infinite ways that humans are alike. Not just in our physiology either, that you could find other things as well. Like that humans possess language, and so forth. So you get that on the one side, but then on the other side, you get this sense that there is an us that distinguishes the group with which one identifies as fundamentally different or distinct, even opposed to other groups. And this, in fact, is how most people experience social reality most of the time, is through this notion of us, this feeling of belonging to a particular community that is exclusive in nature because not everybody belongs to it. And so there are some people who are outside, and the existence of people who are not included is what gives it its notion of coherence of there being an inside. This is how people experience social reality most of the time, is this feeling of belonging to an us. Now, each one of these, the essential sameness or the essential distinctiveness, each one requires a leap, Goodale says, from observable but trivial details, like, say, how we look, to deep but intuitive and therefore not obvious, hard to observe truths of essential sameness or of irreducible difference. So he's taking as a starting point, this notion that we observe these kind of trivial traits among humans, and then from that we make the leap in either direction, either toward universalism or toward particularism. But each one involves a leap, just a leap in the opposite direction. And so in that way, he's thinking there's actually something quite similar about the two, in that they both rely upon this leap from the observable trivialities to the intuited but unobservable specifics, either of a particular or of a universal nature, and that this is what, in a sense, binds them together. It binds universalism and relativism together in this inevitable tension. Ultimately, then, Goodale sees two opposing, which does not mean irreconcilable, sides. Human rights universalists who, he says, believe in the possibility of discovering or creating all-encompassing systems of knowledge, morality, laws. And then on the other side, relativists, quote, who are repelled by the very notion of an all-encompassing system and who spend their lives tracking and relishing in the forces that pull away from the centripetal tendencies of the system builders. Now, he thinks that reconciliation is possible only if the system builders, the universalists on the one side, acknowledge contingency, contradiction, and dilemmas within their all-encompassing systems, and if relativists on the other side will at least entertain the possibility of a unifying framework. Now, on what condition this kind of reconciliation could occur, that's not entirely clear, at least not in this chapter. But this, I think, all that he's saying at this point is what would be necessary for these sides to be able to reconcile. This would be the conditions under which such a reconciliation was possible. Okay, so that's the end of those chapters. He doesn't give us a roadmap for achieving this reconciliation between relativism and universalism, but he sets the stage for us for the next part of the course. From here on, then, we're going to consider in the upcoming readings that there do seem to be universals in all human communities or societies. So we find in all human communities some notion of justice, some notion of fairness, some notion of equality or egalitarianism, and they all play, those three all play an important role in the moral, political, and legal shaping of sociality. And indeed, it's hard to imagine how any community that didn't embrace those three notions in some way could continue to exist. It would tear itself apart from the inside. On the other hand, we can see that there is real incongruence between some groups, and that these incongruities don't lend themselves to shared ideas of humanness, much less rights. Even though they might still have justice, fairness, and equality at their heart, the way that they will understand those three differ quite dramatically in some places. We could think of this simply as the different ways that different religions alone conceptualize these things. And then we can see fairly quickly that there's been a long history of, to put it mildly, religious tension around which notions should prevail and prevail for whom. So then, incongruence. So then for the remainder of the course, we'll look at how anthropologists have grappled with these two tendencies as they bear on questions of human rights. And we'll see this in the way that anthropologists have approached this specifically through ethnographic work and not just through this kind of conceptual, abstract level of consideration of human rights.